Welcome to the very first episode of Rogue Frequencies. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Matt.
And we are creating this podcast for you and us to talk about punk music and culture, but not in a way that you might expect. We are so excited to be using all things punk as a way to learn more about individual and collective human growth and development. Crazy concept. So today for our first episode, we're going to talk a little bit about why we're here and a sneak preview of what's to come. So first, my collaborator and friend, Matt, will you give us a little background on who you are today and how you came to punk?
So like you said, my name's Matt. Longtime punk enthusiast. Not a musician. Just one of my favorite punk rock quotes of all time is that, not everybody can be up on stage. Somebody's got to be out in the pit, right? And that's been me for a long time with punk since I was a little kid. Currently these days I'm employed as a high school history teacher, where I also get to teach about music and identity, along with all sorts of various histories from around the world. And, one of the things that I've always strived to get into my instruction, my professional life, is this idea of a punk attitude. I always tell kids I wear punk on my sleeve, my shirts, my jackets, my hoodies, pins and patches and posters and stickers on the walls of my classrooms and all this sort of stuff. And I always tell my students, punk rock to me isn't just a type of music. It's not a type of melody or a type of chord structure or a tempo. It's an attitude. It's a way that you carry yourself through the world. And as Iggy Pop once said, punk rock is a conversation with society. And, when you put on punk, so to speak, whether it's actually the aesthetic or it's the attitude or it's the music, you're letting the world know that you're not okay with everything that's happening around you, and that there is something about the world that you don't fit in with, that you don't identify with, that you don't feel at peace with, and you're willing to do something about it. And so your punk attitude, your punk aesthetic is a way of initiating that conversation. And that's how I feel about punk rock to this day. And that's why I was so excited to do this podcast with you, to hop into this project. And then on top of it, I get to talk about bands like, my all-time favorite bands, Rancid and Operation Ivy and Bad Religion and NoFX and, delving back into my record collection and CDs and all this sort of stuff, and going back through and these nostalgias for Minor Threat albums that I haven't listened to in a long time. It's been an awesome experience ramping up and gearing up and getting ready to do this podcast, because I get to, have that conversation with myself as well. Like, why am I still into punk? One of the things that always drives me nuts about punk is like when someone comes at you and they're like, hey, I used to listen to those bands back in the day. That was something I used to do back when I was a kid. And I always want to ask those people the same question. Like, why'd you stop? Like, what changed, right? Hopefully you didn't change so much that you lost that part of who you were. Because if it was part of who you were then, it can still be a part of who you are now. And you can be punk wearing a tie, right? You don't have to have on all your spikes and chains and leather and all that sort of stuff. It's always sad to me, though, to think that there might be people out there who have put that down and walked away from it, because it's just meant so much to me. My first exposure to punk rock, like real true punk rock, I must have been about 11 years old on the back of a school bus, listening to a ripped Green Day tape on this little one speaker player that we'd all go get money to pitch in to get, like, the big D batteries for, and we'd listen on the back of the bus until the batteries wore out, and just going back over the tapes. And it was Green Day, it was the Offspring Smash album, started to get Nirvana, and then got the opportunity to start going to shows and concerts not too long after that in the mid-90s, and it's just been a love affair for me ever since, right? And this is a huge part of who I am, and I'm so excited to delve deeper into how punk rock has shaped me as well. All right. So that's me. That's me in punk. Liv, how about you? Like, give us a little background on you and who you are and how you came to punk as well.
Yeah, I hear you talk about the D batteries. Man, those things are enormous. I wanna say were. They're still around, we just don't use them
You just
very
don't
often.
use them as much anymore. Yeah.
Like bricks and, expensive as a kid. So, yeah, I was actually remembering back to, the first CD player that I got as a birthday gift and all the batteries I went through
Oh yeah,
with
do like
that.
that first Discman or whatever. You know.
Mhm.
hmm
Mhm. That's
Big
a
time. That was a
big
big deal.
deal. Yeah, real big deal. Another time I'll tell the story of the first 2 CDs I got and how ironic they were, but they have nothing to do with punk, so we're gonna leave that mystery there for a future time. So I am a little bit older than Matt, and actually when Matt and I met, he was in teacher training at the time. So you
Yeah.
weren't
Jeez.
a teacher yet at the time. I was teaching in early childhood, but you were in your teacher training years. I think we met right before or right after you were in Alaska.
Yeah, it would have been right before.
Yeah, it was a long, long time ago. I have since left the field of early childhood for the most part. I still dabble, but let me back up a little bit. So I have a master's, and this is not really the answer to the why punk question, but I'll get there. So I have a master's in educational psychology. I started in early childhood and decided to go get my master's degree. And I specifically chose educational psychology over early childhood education because I'm such a geek for how people think, learn, grow, develop. And in a lot of ways, I have always questioned why people don't develop. Why do they stop developing? Or why do they get stuck into patterns? Or why does one brain work this way and another brain works another? And so I did that as my master's, and I was in early childhood education and administration for over 20 years. In 2002, it was clearly time for a career change after I found myself burned out to the point that I was diagnosed with depression and generalized anxiety. And went through a whole journey there, which included therapy, medication, and doing something that I had said 10 or 12 years prior I wanted to do when I grew up, which was be a coach and be specifically a leadership and empowerment coach. So I went back to school. I studied integral coaching at one of the top coaching programs, and I have since transitioned into personal and professional coaching and consulting. So that's what I do. But let's talk about who I am related to punk, because that's more fun.
Always more fun to talk about punk.
Always more fun. And that is the question you asked, but I took the long road there. So I was punk curious, I like to call it, in high school.
It's such a great term.
Punk curious. I I was one of those folks in high school where I floated between a lot of different groups. So was a theater kid by heart and by nature, and I'm a band geek as a saxophonist. So I played saxophone fourth grade all the way up through high school years, and loved music, loved theater. Studied vocal under a former Broadway conductor.
Ooh,
Fun fact that you may not have known about me,
I
Matt.
did
Yeah.
not know that. Look
He
at
was a retired
that.
Broadway conductor, and I studied vocal musical theater with him for many, many years. So I was a theater geek and also was the kid in the, AP classes, but like it wasn't like a super sporty spice, wasn't really sporty at all, did a little tennis, but I was really able to transition and float between various groups of people in high school. And so um my music tastes were really eclectic because I was influenced by so many different groups of people. While I was a theater geek, I was also, listening to other kinds of music. And in high school, one of the first things I remember feeling so subversive about music was Bikini Kill because they were
Mm.
copied tapes. I think we were burning CDs then, but we actually were burning CDs then. I remember I have books of CDs in my car, but Bikini Kill was tapes, and it
Right.
was copied tapes with photocopied inserts, and it
Yes,
felt
I remember those days. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it felt almost like my equivalent of like boys hiding the porn magazine under their mattress.
You had Kathleen Hanna.
Yeah, I had a Kathleen Anna.
Just
Um,
as subversive, maybe more.
Maybe,
Maybe more.
differently
Yeah.
so. And but I didn't. Anyway, so I had that a little bit. Green Day hit the pop scene when I was in high school, and
Huge,
who wasn't
huge.
influenced by Dookie?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was, listening to you talk. I don't know if you're familiar with labor organizer, author, podcaster Amber Lee Frost, who talks about, when you're in high school, you try on hats, you try on, this hat and that hat and do all those sorts of things. And one of the hats she always brings up when she's in this conversation is like, you got to try on the punk hat. Like when you're this age, you have to try on the punk hat. And I think everybody of a certain age range tried on the Green Day hat. You had to.
Yeah, you had to,
It
and
it was
they
so
hit the
different.
scene so hard, and it
Yeah.
was it was the days of we did not know we were at the end of the top 40 era,
Hmm.
but we were. Those were the last pushes of the top 40 era, and so we were listening to mainstream radio stations, and when that album hit, it broke through because we were coming out of sort of the Michael Bolton era of adult contemporary pop, and
Yeah.
it just smashed through so hard. So, actually, fun story about that album that relates to Colorado. So, I grew up in Maine. Matt, I know you grew up here in Colorado. Close family friends. My auntie Liz, she wasn't really an auntie, she's a family friend. Her niece and nephew lived in Boulder, Colorado, and they would come visit every other summer-ish, give or take. And Ben showed up. He was my age, and he showed up with the Dookie album. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then Maine can be a little slow. It could have been a little slower to get the influences then. It was like 3 weeks or a month later that it really blew up. And I was like, oh, I'm like an insider. I'm so
Right, right. I knew
glad
about this
that you know
before.
this album. So funny how I ended up here years later and will likely never leave. The other big, big, big punk influence for me was Rustic Overtones, and they were a main ska band. So
Oh, dude, the ska band scene, so big.
so big in that Mighty Mighty Boss Tones feel and, that Real Big Fish feel. And so Rustic Overtones, I heard them. I went to a New Year's Portland with my parents. So I had to be 14 or 15. And you went to all these different places and they had different things, comedy and music and all this different stuff. And you just traveled around Portland, Maine, and there was all these different things going on. And stumbled across Rustic Overtones and was like, whoa, this is amazing. And I was a saxophonist. And this is brass and woodwinds hitting this pop music-y feeling scene was like, what? This is amazing. This is meant to be. And then me and my friends over the years, we were going to their shows all the time and just having a blast. Rustic Overtones never hit it, quote, big. They got caught up in the age-old story of joining a record company. I believe it was Arista Records, and
No.
their signing agent got canned and they got shelved. And then you can't perform or play because there's this whole ownership piece. So that kind of fell by the wayside. I've been hearing that they've been doing reunion shows in Maine. Their lead singer passed away, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, unfortunately. So relatively young. But they have been doing some reunion shows. I do hope that I'll catch one when I'm back in Maine sometime.
The local ska band was another one of those like key elements. I know in there were lots of bands floating around like this out in Denver in the mid 90s when, I was like, I'm 12, 13 years old, I guess. And I was like this little skater kid, but I couldn't skate. I was like gangly. I'm tall for listeners out there. I'm a large person. And skating just wasn't for me. Like I didn't have the coordination. There was a lot of snap boards
At the
and
image, not the
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like Joey Ramone, like living his life. That was like me on a skateboard. Um, but part of like being in that scene, in that milieu of stuff was the school I went to, which was like a charter school, one of the first charter schools in Colorado. One of the students who was there, he was a high school kid. I'm like in seventh grade probably. And one of his friends was in this local ska band called Five Iron Frenzy, which ended up
Oh,
making
yeah,
it pretty
yeah.
big and touring around and stuff. And they were, I believe,
They're
a
still
saxophone
playing.
player in that band. And so, being around them and talking and one of the cool things about that time period, and you alluded to it, was people always showing up with music. This is pre-internet times and people would show up with this CD or this tape. Increasingly in the late '90s, mid to late '90s, right? It was CDs. People would pop up with CDs. Someone would have gone to a show and they went to the merch table and picked up a CD, and someone was, I was talking to this guy and he had on this shirt, and we'd go figure out like what this band was. The school I went to didn't have a school bus. We had the RTD bus, and the RTD bus that I rode home every single day in Denver used to go out of downtown. The school is in downtown Denver, and it lead, kind of going east out of the city back up into the neighborhoods. And we'd go by legendary record store Wax Trax Records. It was just like right there. And so I remember like the first time mustering up the courage, like when I was like 10, maybe 11 years old, of like, I'm going to get off the bus at the wrong stop. I'm going to go to Wax Trax, and I'm just going to go see what this is all about. And at that point, Wax Trax was like an entire city block. There was like 7 different stores. So you could go to like Wax Trax or like Wax Trax Hip Hop, Wax Trax all, and they were all numbered out. And so you could go in there and you'd flip through CDs. And of course, like the record store people, it was like the Empire Records, like they'd clock you when you came in, like you were going to be in there to steal. And really, we were just in there to like be exposed, like see what's on the walls and flip through things and try to find bands. And sometimes you'd find stuff and it was not punk or whatever. But like, yeah, that whole time period that you just stumbling on bands and stumbling on music was such a huge part of, like, like Amberly Frost said, you put on the hat and you try it on. And like for me in that time, and it sounds like for you to an extent, like tightening the hat and fitting it, and like I think I'm going to keep this one for a long time anyway.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely tightened that hat. I took the hat off for a little bit. But I remember, I would listen to Rustic Overtones, their CDs, like, just nonstop, and I'd come out of my room and my dad would be like, "How was your circus music?" He described ska as circus music, which I can't not think of because it does have that, like, oompa, oompa,
Hmm.
oompa, you know?
That
Um,
syncopation, yeah, just makes you want
yeah.
to move. Yeah.
Exactly. And we should mention here, Matt has another podcast, Storytime with the Historists, and they have, is it 2 parts on ska?
It's like a one deep dive.
One deep dive. I think I
Yeah.
keep calling it 2 parts because it's long, but it's really good on ska. Go check that out. We'll point to it here. But I was super into that, and it was, it was a culture, it was a scene. Into that. I went to college in the late 90s, and the groups I was in, they were more jam bandy people. So I played in the jam band space. I'll be honest, those are the longest concerts of my life.
Mm.
Uh, I tried it on. I stayed there for a while. It wasn't really for me. But years and years later, fast forward to 12 years ago now, so many, many, many years after college, I got together with my now partner who had always been also punk curious, but had actually never really gone to concerts. He'd only gone to like a couple concerts in his life, and we're in our 30s. And so we started checking out punk concerts together. And so in my late 30s, I kind of had this resurgence of fitting that hat back on, and it's certainly a hat I will not take off again.
That's so crazy hearing you say, that, your partner didn't go to a lot of shows and stuff, and knowing what I know about them and where they grew up and what was right there at their fingertips. I mean, like
Right?
when
You
when we've talked at shows or whenever and been like, man, if I could have been there, because it felt like Denver it wasn't a desert, but it was harder to know what was going on. And in certain places in the country, in the 80s and 90s, like that scene was just in your face. And that scene in particular that your partner was right there, right around, man, that would have been so cool to have had the opportunity to get there and see some of those bands when they were
Yeah.
young and on the come up and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, being in the Bay Area and not, like, being where
Yeah.
so much of more modern punk scene grew out of, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah.
I also am a little bit shocked by that. And, um, we don't hindsight is a whole thing, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, totally. Now it's easy to see.
Yeah, totally. So I mentioned that Bikini Kill was probably my entry, and then Green Day, Offspring being there. I
Hmm.
loved the Smash album. I was obsessed with the Smash album, and when Americana came out, it was
Yeah,
Americana.
yeah. A couple years later, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. I did have it, and I did listen to it, and I didn't love it the same way. And I remember lamenting with a boyfriend at the time that I loved Smash and I wanted them to go back to it. And he was like, "Well, that's not really who they are. They're more of this pop stuff." And I was like, "No, it feels authentic to me." And
Right.
since then I've been to a ton of Offspring shows, and their music sort of stays in that poppiness but can have this harder uh feel to it too. So anyway, Offspring was big because yeah, pop punk does it for me. It still does. But some of the other bands that I'm super into is Sleater-Kinney, because as we'll talk about as this pod goes on, my feminist roots
Hmm.
are the feminist roots are strong in this one. My undergrad degree is women's studies. And recently, I've really been into Cheap Perfume and Team Non-Existent, both out of the Denver metro area. We'll talk about those in later seasons. And I'm so sorry to tell you, Matt, but I am a ride or die, no doubter. And I know Eric really was the roots and that Gwen was, not OG. But I did love that you could be girly and still be pop punk. And that was a big influence. I actually had a friend in high school who moved high schools for senior year to a boarding school that was kind of far away. And another friend and I drove to her graduation, and we must have played that album like 5 times
The
over.
Tragic Kingdom album.
The Tragic
Yeah.
Kingdom album, yeah.
I think like the thing about No Doubt is like, yeah, if you go open my CD wallet, you will find a very well worn, scratched up, their very first debut when they were a very ska band, still before they moved into that space that Green Day and Offspring opened up in the mid 90s for all those kind of breakthrough, breakout bands. But I mean, they still were playing in Tragic Kingdom. There's some songs that are still legit. Like if I go back to the soundtrack of my life at a certain point in time, there was No Doubt that was there. And we'll get into this a little bit later in future episodes about like people and how they're perceived in the scene. But I just have to say, if we're being honest about the situation of punk and everything else in that time, I don't think there was a punker type person, ska influence type person who didn't like Gwen Stefani for whatever reason. Right. Like, she was this embodiment of like energy, and her sound was so like unique, and the way she could command a stage at that young age, and then on top of it she was just very attractive. And so in a very male dominated music scene, it was pretty hard not to notice Gwen
Yeah.
and say like, all right, I don't know if I'm here for the music, but I'm here for something, right? And whatever that something might have been,
And
right?
she's kind of the Dolly Parton of punk.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about her. Yeah.
Which is funny now that she's, married to a country musician, but we'll leave that there and we'll move into what you can expect from us in this first season of Rogue Frequencies, because we're setting a stage here. We have a full season for you that we've actually sneak peek behind the scenes. We actually recorded it before the intro because we wanted to know what was becoming. So you can hear us allude to what's coming up because we know what's coming up. So
It's
stay
like a
with us
crystal. It's
because
like a magic 8 ball for the podcast.
yeah, stay with us because we have some cool stuff coming. So what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at these themes of human development. We're going to do it through punk music, subgenres, bands, culture. You'll hear some of this riffing where we go back and forth, and where we throw in some color commentary about our experiences in the scene, what Matt has learned and studied as our resident historist. And then I'll bring in the coaching flavor of how can we use punk as metaphor, allegory, whatever you want to call it, for this unique experience of life. So you'll hear us talk about our primary punk influences, like we talked about a little bit today. We'll talk actually about some bands and individuals that are a little cringy and maybe cancel worthy, and what we can learn from them as well. It's not
It
just
is
the
punk. I mean, it's, it is what it is.
yeah, so we're not just doing rose-colored glasses here. We're not just going down this road of like, every punk band is great or everybody should be into punk. Like there's some questionable actors in here. So we'll talk about those as well. And then we'll talk about how we've been influenced and inspired by bands, genres, etc. And if you stick with us late in the season, you're actually going to get the origin story of the inspiration that started this podcast. So stick with us to that, because we drop some real nuggets about our lives, and also our hero worship throughout this season.
It's a good term for it. Yeah. Our punk rock heroes.
Yeah, our punk rock heroes, and our the ones we want to keep at more than an arm's distance, maybe that 99.5 foot pole, in the words of Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
So we hope that you will join us for this full first season of Rogue Frequency, where we're going to do just what we've been doing a little bit today, but we're going to deeper dive into subgenres and bands. We're going to learn more about ourselves, each other, how we can be inspired to grow and develop. So for this first episode, we invite you, as soon as you're done listening, to take a look at our Spotify playlist. It has some of our favorite bands and songs that we will feature throughout the season. And in future episodes, you will also find a playlist that includes songs from the bands and genres that we discuss in that episode.
I'm really excited to kick this thing off proper and get into it. And just urge, listeners and people out there to think about, punk with an open mind. In the words of Tim Armstrong, who are any of us to say what punk is? How can you tell somebody what's inside of them, and how they're going to experience their life and the world around them? And I think that what we have cooked up here is a really great way of thinking about the ethos, the core of what punk rock is, and how you can use that to navigate your life and to come to an understanding about who you are as an individual, and where you fit in, and where you don't, and how you can move forward in your life in a way that makes you feel like you, right? So I'm excited for this. I think it's
Yeah.
going to be a great journey for a lot of people to join us with.
It's been a great journey for me, that's for sure. But we'll get to more of that later. So perfect that we are closing out with some inspiration from Tim Timebomb. Stay tuned to future episodes where you'll learn a little bit more about Tim Timebomb. And with that, thank you for joining Rogue Frequencies. We look forward to you joining us in the first full episode.
Bye.